off we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to February's NHBG Zoom talk. And this evening, we have Sarah Pearson, Dr. Sarah Pearson, to speak to us about Riddlesworth, the development and decline of a Norfolk estate. Riddlesworth, of course, is quite important in our general group history, in that Rosemary went to school there many years ago. So she has a particular interest, I think. Before we start, though, I want to give you a little bit of information from Ian, and also to tell you about the next two meetings. Ian tells us that the newsletter is going to be sent out at the end of March, and it's packed with all sorts of summer visits, treats, 7 visits, which includes 5 houses. So that's going to be pretty wonderful. Also, just to mention the next two meetings before we get down to Sarah. On March the 15th, it's Members' Evening, which is always very popular with the NHBG. This year we've got Gillian Gallagher talking about the landscape of river crossings, which I think will be very interesting. And we have Ian talking about the greens and farmhouses of North Fulham. And then in, where am I? In April, we've got an extra speaker this year, Stuart Burgess, who works at the Elizabethan House in Great Yarmouth and has been doing quite a lot of research into it, has offered to give us a talk and also a guided visit at some point, but he's going to give us a talk on the 13th of April, a Thursday, on the Elizabethan House. So that's 3 more meetings before we start the summer season. So that's very, I think, very good year for us, I think. Okay, now, Dr. Sarah Pearson lives now in New Buckingham, which is, of course, where we based our first journal. So we know all about New Buckingham. She's talking about the place where she used to live, which is near the Riddlesworth estate. She is an architectural historian with specialist interest in the architecture of the European Renaissance and in the use of architecture to promote specific ideological or sociological principles. Her PhD was from the University of Reading, and the subject of her doctoral thesis was the architect Francesco di Giorgio Martini, is that on whom she's published articles and contributed to the book Reconstructing Francesco di Giorgio, Architect. Sarah has enjoyed teaching and lecturing at universities and adult education institutions on a wide variety of art and architectural subjects since 2001. How do you say these dates these days? I've forgotten. She currently teaches at Cambridge University and retains active research interest in Italian art and architecture, with particular reference to the rise of fascism and its expression through Italian design, which sounds fantastic. Very interesting. Another evening maybe, but not really related to Norfolk. So back to Riddlesworth tonight. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Right, I shall just share my screen. Here we go. And hopefully everybody now can see my talk popping up. There we go. So, Riddlesworth, the development and decline of a Norfolk estate. And I have to say, it's a subject which was of interest to me because I used to live right near the hall. So it was something we saw a lot. And this is why we started researching it. As estates go, it's not a particularly big one or an especially significant one, but I still find it very interesting, really as a template of the life of a house, essentially. And not just the architecture, though that's the thing which I find the most fascinating, but also the people who inhabited it and the ways in which they shaped the landscape of which they were a part. So this is what we have today. This is Riddlesworth Hall. And by the end of the talk, you will know why I'm calling it Riddlesworth 3, largely because it's the third hall on the site. And I said I'm particularly interested in architecture. So one of the questions for me would be, why was it built this way? Why does it look the way it does? And we will come to that and see that it looks like this because of a process of architectural development from the earlier halls on the site. The other thing I should say for people who don't know Riddlesworth is where it is, because you may not know. So it's on the border of Norfolk and Suffolk. It's on the Norfolk side of the Norfolk-Suffolk border. It's equidistant between Thetford and Diss, so it's about 30 miles from Norwich, according to Google Maps, which I checked earlier. So in the middle of the Norfolk countryside. And here we see it from the air, thanks to Google Earth. And what I wanted to do first was to show you all of the various components which come together to create this estate. First and foremost, obviously, there's the house itself. So this is the house just here, that's Riddlesworth Hall. But then it's surrounded by other buildings which have come into being over the course of about 400 years. So we have a number of farms surrounding it. We have Lodge Farm off to the east. And then below we have Hall Farm, which used to be called Manor Farm and was seen as the sort of most important of the farms. And then we also have Home Farm up at the top there. So 3 farms whose sole purpose was to supply the hall, which gives you an idea of the impact on the environment that this hall had at its sort of height. And then we have additional small buildings as well. So we have Butler's Cottage just there. And over here we have Laundry Cottage. Many titles are very useful in terms of working out what the buildings were for. We have a number of lodge houses about the place. And then we also have the stud cottages, because Riddlesworth was connected with racing for a while, horse racing. So there was the Riddlesworth stud. And then we also have the gamekeeper's cottage as well. So you can see on this landscape, lots of buildings, each one now in separate ownership. So there is nothing left of the estate as a joined up functioning piece of land and architecture. Everything's been sold off a piece at a time. But whilst it was in its heyday, we can see that there have been 4 major owners of the Riddlesworth estate and, by extension, Riddlesworth Hall. And it's quite interesting to look at them. We see we have the Drurys first, followed by Bevan, then Thornhill, and finally the Champion family. And other than the Drury family, who managed 181 years, we can see relatively short periods of time. And in particular, Bevan, when he took over, we're talking 1 generation there. For Drury, it was 4 generations of the same family. For Thornhill, we have 3 generations, and Champion similarly. Whereas Bevan, it's just 1 man for 25 years, and yet his impact on the Riddlesworth estate was massive. I think it's fair to say if there was a prize for most influential, he would probably win just because of quite how much he put into the estate, which I will talk about obviously when we get to Bevan. But yes, duration of ownership doesn't seem to equate necessarily to the amount of impact that the owner had. But where to start with Riddlesworth? Well, my main focus is from when the hall was constructed, which for me is when the architecture starts, the really interesting bit. But it's worth looking at the Domesday Book and seeing that, yes, Riddlesworth has been around for quite a long time, certainly since 1086, when it was Riddlefordwa, which is place abounding with reeds, which makes sense based on how much thatch there is, reed thatch in Norfolk. So this was a place where reeds were abundant. And if we look at how the estate or the land looked in the Domesday Book, we can see there were 4 freemen with 27 acres of land. We have 1 slave, 1 plough and 1 horse, 13 pigs, so, you know, not bad for pigs. And then we have 21 sheep, and the total value of the area was 30 shillings. And this is comparable with nearby places such as Gasthorpe and Nettishall. 30 shillings was about right for the area. So it's not hugely more valuable than anywhere else at this time. But it is useful for us to know that there were people in situ in 1086, because of course the land, the environment was there before Hall number 1 was built. And so the earliest building which still survives in some state is most likely the church. Here it is today, St. Peter's Riddlesworth, a very lovely church. But the earliest form of this probably, and I say probably, huge amounts of conjecture here, but something like this, a very simple single space building. It would certainly have been thatched, and it would have formed the core of what came later. So ultimately this would transform into this, and I will show you that transformation as we go through. So when the earliest church was in position, we don't exactly know. The quinquennial report puts it at the 11th century, which is quite early, but certainly we know that by the 15th century, there was a church not that dissimilar to what we have today. We can see there are some basic differences. It doesn't yet have a chancel on the east end. So I'm just going to put my little pointer on. There we go. So yes, no chancel on the east end as yet. No porch over the door. That's something which will come later. Thatched throughout, and you can still see on the building today the lines where the thatch used to be. And another interesting feature of this church, which you do find in some other churches, but it's not such a common feature, is the processional arch. If you look at the base of the tower there, you can see sort of half of a doorway, and there's a reciprocal doorway on the other side of that tower. And this was to allow the congregation, the clergy, whoever, to process through the church at that point. Now, as to why they needed to process through the church at that point, it's thought that possibly it's because the church boundary is where that fence line is. You can see the fence line just here, and snug next to the church, that's the end of the church land, and beyond it is what is now the Riddlesworth estate. So in terms of staying on consecrated ground, possibly that's why this processional arch was needed just here. Sadly, it's now closed up, so you can no longer process through it. Let's move on to our next slide. So, ownership of the land. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but it's just to show that, yes, this parcel of land called Riddlesworth can be traced through. Lordship of the manor, we can see from 1249, we can trace that, and we can take it right through to 1456 at the bottom there, and beyond, of course. And the reason I put this in is because whilst Riddlesworth Hall number 1 is the first big house we know of on the site, it's unlikely to have been the first house on the site, but we just don't have any evidence or knowledge really of buildings which might have preceded the first big hall building. So by 1456, the Riddlesworth estate is owned by Thomas Sackville, as you can see, with his wife Elizabeth, and they sell it. Click, here we are. They sell it to Sir Philip Calthorpe of Wharton in Suffolk. And this is important because this shows us how the lands ultimately end up with the Drury family. So in a very roundabout way, we get to our first Lord of the Manor. And our first Lord of the Manor is, of course, Drew Drury. And here he is. This is a sculpture from his tomb, which is in the church we just looked at in St. Peter's, Riddlesworth. It's an absolutely amazing tomb sculpture. I'll show you a couple more images of it in a bit. It was originally painted, as you can see, so it retains slight traces of paint still, but it appears to be quite a good portrait. And at that point, it's very interesting to be able to see exactly what, or close to what, Drew Drury might have looked like. So he is our first Lord of the Manor. How does he come to be Lord of the Manor? Well, he marries Elizabeth Calthorpe. So this is the daughter of the people who owned the Riddlesworth. And part of her dowry, she bought him Lordship Manor of Riddlesworth. So this is how Drew Drury ends up in charge. He then proceeds to pass the hall down his family line, and it's really confusing. As you can see, not only his son, but also his grandson were also called Drew Drury, which can make it quite confusing when you're working out which Drury you're talking about. And then eventually we get to Robert Drury, and he's the final male owner of Riddlesworth before it's passed on to the next family, to Bevan. So why should we know Drew Drury first? He's a very interesting chap, and he has very strong links to Elizabeth I. Obviously, he's Elizabethan. The family themselves have Norman origins, but under Elizabeth I, he was made a gentleman usher of the Privy Chamber, which is quite a high status position within the circle surrounding Elizabeth I. So this shows us that he was really quite a trusted individual to the Queen. And furthermore, his wife, Elizabeth Calthorpe, was the Queen's first cousin. So again, strong links, which was no doubt very useful to him in terms of social advancement. Now, the reason we're looking here at the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, is because one of his duties was to act as executioner or to assist in executions for Elizabeth I. And he oversaw the execution of the Babington conspirators. So this was the group who were in support of Mary, Queen of Scots. And following on from this, he was tasked with arresting Mary, Queen of Scots and taking her to Fotheringay Castle, where she was tried and ultimately executed, as we can see. Now, Robert Bill was there. He left a very interesting written account of what happened and some lovely drawings, including this one, which you can see has got numbers for some of the individuals about the place. And on the back of this sheet is a key to go with it, which is how I can tell you definitively that Drew Drury is number 4. So there he is sitting at the back with his hat on. That's Drew Drury observing the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. And apparently Mary, Queen of Scots was quite nice about him. She said he showed more sympathy and compassion than others of the people surrounding her. So it all leads to the belief that perhaps he was quite a nice chap. So this is what he did. And then following on from this and clearly going up the ranks in terms of service to the Queen, he was made Lieutenant of the Tower of London in 1596. So somebody like this, an Elizabethan who's in at court, who's got important roles and who is serving the Queen, is going to need a nice house. And this is why we have the construction of the first Riddlesworth Hall. Sadly, we don't have any verified imagery of what that first hall looked like. We just can't be certain. But because he's Elizabethan, he's building in the Tudor style, we can conjecture quite definitely what it may have looked like. And here I've put up a Wharton Hall, which is the home of his first wife, just to give you a parallel, really. And whilst it wouldn't have looked exactly like this, they would have had shared qualities, not least that it would have had a timber frame and a brick cladding, most likely. It may well have had the E plan, which was very popular in the Elizabethan period, E for Elizabeth, of course. And given how supportive he was of Elizabeth, that might well be the case. We could expect some degree of symmetry, potentially a long gallery somewhere in the building, formal gardens quite definitely, and the sort of windows which we see here, these lovely Tudor windows, either using a perpendicular arch or here, as you see, with the rectangular hood moulding. So hall number 1 would have looked something like this. And it's a great sadness, really, that we don't know more about its physical appearance. But Drury built it, and he would have certainly wanted to create a hall which was worthy of his position and status at that time. In addition, it's Drury who built the 3 farms. So these were all launched in his period in order to, as I said, service the hall, to provide all of the food and meat and so on for the hall. And whilst the farms themselves have upgraded and the buildings have changed and so on, the closest we may get to the Drury original may well be the barns. So home at the top there, glorious barn framed within, potentially could be, at least in part, of medieval construction. So yes, the barns are where we would need to look to find those earliest interventions by Drury. Now, Drury, of course, ultimately died, and I showed you that close-up of his tomb monument. This is in St. Peter's Church. The shields, as you can see, were repainted quite recently. Well, I say quite recently, I think about 100 years ago, actually. So that's why they are so bright, because they have all been repainted. But otherwise, the carving has been very much left, but it is exceptionally well done. So we have Drury there, as you can see, kneeling at a prayer desk, and he's in a sort of niche with curtains being pulled aside by angels. And it's interesting, there are a couple of examples of very similar tomb sculpture in Norfolk in this period. So it may be that somebody was doing the rounds with this particular tomb style and offering it about to various houses. But it's lovely for us because it gives us this idea of this man and what he might have looked like. And not just him, because if I go back a slide, there is a projecting section just here. You can just see it bulging out there. So above his head and looking down, there's a face carved into the stonework, and that's not found in any similar tombs. And if I take you forward to it, it looks like this. And it's thought this may be his first wife who predeceased him, looking down on him from above, which I quite like that idea. Certainly it doesn't look particularly like we are supposed to think it's the face of God or anything like that. So a female face looking down on him, I think it being his first wife, Elizabeth Calthorpe, might well be the answer. And I put in, this is just a detail of his armour to show you the exceptional carving. And it's not just at the front. This is another interesting feature of this sculpture, that it's carved in the round. So even the bits you can't see around the back are still carved to this level. So it's well worth a look. You can just see traces of paint there on the belt as well. Just here, still touches of red, but doubtless over time it's had the occasional touch up. So that's Drury. So he launches the whole business, builds the first hall, and leaves it to his son, who then passes it on. And the next 2 Drurys don't do a whole lot more. They continue to use the hall, but by the time we get to Sir Robert Drury, things have changed quite significantly. And we have this lease document, the George Cook of Thetford, where he leases the estate. The reason that Robert Drury has to lease the estate is because he's in a lot of trouble. And it seems to be this age-old story of one person builds the family up, and then a few generations later, somebody pulls it back down again. Robert Drury was convicted of manslaughter in 1669. And as a result of that conviction, the lordship was taken away from him. So he was no longer lord of the manor, but he retained the estate. So he still owns the Riddlesworth estate. He seemed to enjoy quite an active and expensive lifestyle, as a result of which he built up quite significant debts. And he was constantly trying to raise more money on the back of the estate to lease it out. So he's no longer living there, he's renting it. But it's jolly helpful for us because the hall is described in this lease document, and it tells us just a little bit about that elusive building. So it details that there was a great hall and a great parlour. We have a withdrawing room with closet and a dining room. The withdrawing room known as King James' chamber. Sadly, it doesn't say which King James, because it could be one or two, but it's not clear on that. Other chambers, a coach house and stable, a courtyard, a great garden, a banqueting house, which sounds like a separate structure potentially within this garden, an arched cellar, a wine cellar, a wash house, a brew house, pasture and timber. So incredibly useful because, as I said, Drew Drury would have wanted a house which reflected his status. And I think this certainly demonstrates this wasn't a small building. This was a building of some quality, quite definitely. So before we leave the Drurys, the next thing that happens is the Great Storm. This is a huge event. It's thought now it was possibly a tropical cyclone or something like that, but it hit England en masse on the 26th of November 1703, and the effects were still being felt weeks later. So it was a storm which went on or repeated for some time. And East Anglia seems to have been particularly hard hit. Nationwide, it's thought that between 8,000 and 15,000 people died, with a loss of between 800 and 900 houses. So this would be big houses. We have 700 ships being sunk, which is the image that we have here, which represented about a third of the entire English fleet. We have 400 windmills being destroyed. The problem being that the wind blew so much that the sails went round and round and the bearings got hot and caught fire. And then because the windmills were full of flour, they exploded at that point. So there were a lot of exploding windmills. And in terms of the hall, why it's important for us, lots and lots of people were killed by falling chimneys. Because of course, in the Tudor period, big chimneys were something you wanted. It was an expression of your wealth and your status to have these really high brickwork chimneys, and the storm brought them down. And this is exactly what happened at Riddlesworth. So in St. Peter's Church, we have the tomb slabs for two women, Eleanor Drury and her maidservant, Mary Fisher. And according to the local legend, they were both in bed and the chimneys fell through the roof onto the bedroom and killed both of them. It's rather lovely. The tomb of Mary Fisher quite often is noticed by people visiting the church because we can see it's dedicated to her by her true and faithful lover, Anthony Drury of Mendlesham in Norfolk, but he wasn't actually her husband. So she was married to somebody else. But anyway, this is why they're there, because yes, they were both killed in the Great Storm of 1703. So finally, Robert Drury dies. His widow, Diana, we see her tombstone here, she continues to live on at the hall for a bit longer. And then following her death in 1744, the estate is first of all willed to relatives, and then those relatives sell it on. So Diana Drury is the last Drury who was resident at Riddlesworth Hall. Which brings us to Sylvanus Bevan, who is the next person to have an impact. And as I said, the biggest impact on the Riddlesworth estate. Another really interesting chap, Bevan, and he was a member of the Berkeley family. His mother was Elizabeth Berkeley, and he worked for the firm Berkeley, Bevan and Benning, which is now Barclays Bank. So this is where he got his income from. He was a Quaker, and as you can see, in 1769, he marries another Quaker, Isabella Wakefield, who dies very quickly, aged 17, so very sadly as well. And following on from this, he marries a second time, Louisa Kendall, who was the daughter of another banker. But interestingly, she was not a Quaker. And according to the literature, he was expelled at this point from the movement because he chose to marry a non-Quaker. And then finally, once he's got his second marriage underway, he buys the Riddlesworth estate and immediately sets about improving it. So he tears down that Drury manor house and he builds a new home, Riddlesworth 2, slightly to the south. The books say slightly to the south, but the local legend, if you talk to anybody who lives about Riddlesworth, they say slightly to the east. So even there, we don't have a firm opinion on where hall number 1 was. So already you can see from this, he sets about huge change in improving by tearing down the manor house, but that's absolutely in keeping with the period, because we're now into that period of great country house building. So he was not alone in replacing a Tudor building with something which was perceived as more up to date. And this is what he built. We're very lucky to have a photograph of it. This is Riddlesworth 2. The photograph is 1890, so obviously some time after Bevan, but it's a fascinating piece of architecture because I said, this is the time of country house building. It absolutely is. We've got Holkham, Howcombe going up, Chatsworth further up the country, but those were houses which were built by the landed gentry who had done the grand tour. They come back from the grand tour. They've spent so long, years in some cases, looking at the architecture of the continent. They've had columns and capitals, all of this. And then they come home to their red brick Tudor mansion and they look at it and think, no, it's dreadful. And this is why we get those new constructions. But it's not quite the same here with Bevan, because as far as we know, for a start, he didn't do a grand tour. So he didn't have that experience of going abroad and absorbing all of the art and culture. And yet we can see that this house is Neo-Palladian, quite definitely Neo-Palladian, but it's also incredibly plain and incredibly simple. And I would hypothesize that even if Bevan had left the Quakers, the simplicity of the religion stayed with him, because this is really not a showy architecture for the period. We can see that the portico there, I'll just put my pointer on again. There we go, look, we've got a Tuscan order for the portico, really simple, not even a base on the column there. Tuscan is the lowest architectural order you can use. It's pure, simple, it relates to farming. And if you follow the anthropomorphic qualities of architecture, you're expressing very definitely your sort of simplicity and rustic qualities using that order. We have Palladian openings on the side projections. This window here is called a Palladian window. Palladio popularized it. He didn't actually invent it, but he did make it very popular. So that alone shouts out that this building is Neo-Palladian. And then we have the rusticated basement section. So a sort of, you give the impression of solidity and security. And then the whole building, as we can see, constructed of brick. And that's really interesting. Rather than stone or something really fancy and expensive, brick is much more cost effective. And Bevan established a brickworks at nearby Nettishall to make galt brick, so a sort of yellowy grey brick. And there's little doubt that he established that brickworks in order to supply materials for the hall. So I think it's a beautiful building, but yes, it's an incredibly simple building, as we can see. If we go around the other side, this is the north face, so this faces the road. It's the face you would come up to in your carriage and dismount. If we go around to the other side, oh, there we go. If we go around to the other side, not such a good photograph here, but enough to give us an idea of what the building looked like. Again, photographed in 1890, but we can see we've got a grand temple front. So very much in keeping with Neo-Palladian design, with 4 pilasters here supporting that pediment, all on this rusticated basement. Oh, sorry, gone too far there. But again, it's really, really simple. In a grander country house, we would expect that order to be Corinthian or composite, something really flamboyant and flowery. We'd expect a lot more surface decoration, and we don't get any of that. It's a very plain building for the time of its construction, which actually Palladio would have approved of, because he said that your building should be appropriate to your owner, and certainly this building is appropriate to Bevan. Having these photographs is great because we also have this depiction of the second Riddlesworth Hall. So this is from 1830, an engraving. And the first thing we can see is that something's not quite right, because we are looking here at the south face. That's the face I've just showed you, this one. And yet we can see we have Palladian openings there. And the most likely explanation is that Neil and Matthews never actually saw the hall, and that they were working from either a written description or sketches or something like that, because what they've done is to conflate the 2 sides of the building. I don't think, looking at that earlier slide, that we're looking at a window having been removed and a different set of windows put in. I think they've taken the Palladian openings from the front and they've mixed them with the portico section from the back. So what it does tell us is that engravings like this are great, but we have to take them with a pinch of salt when we're considering the information they can give us about what these buildings looked like. So that's the second Riddlesworth Hall, a very lovely building. It's possible that the carriage yard at Riddlesworth, in whole or in part, also dates from this period. You can see the top of St. Peter's Church there, just poking up over the edge. So it's quite snug up against the church site. And in particular here, the paving that you can see, this may be an astrological pavement, because there was a brief fashion for the astrological pavement, which was something which had been very popular in Italy. So again, we have to question why it would be here, given that we don't think Bevan did a grand tour and went to Italy. But it's either a 5-pointed star or potentially the sun in the middle, not a 5-pointed, sorry, 8-pointed star here. And then we have these circles set around the edge. And so there are also 8 of them. So you could interpret it as the sun and the planets, but the difficulty with that is, I checked, at the end of the 18th century, there were only 7 planets, as far as anybody was aware. So it could be 7 planets and the moon, possibly. We don't know, but it's interesting that it's there. And yes, it's a very lovely feature of the building. Otherwise, the buildings have been renovated quite significantly. And over to the right, the part that we can't see is where the coach house, the big openings to contain coaches were. We also have 2 lodge houses being built in this period, the West and East Lodge. And these relate to the position of the road at the time, because the roads ran quite close to the hall. And we can say these are definitely Bevan construction because they use the same brick. You can see, once again, we have the Galt brick being employed. And even more than that, I would argue we have that same profile there with that arch as we saw on the front of the hall on the north face. So I think the buildings are slightly linked as well through their architectural design. And we have the rectory built in this period. Sorry, this is from my husband's postcard collection. It's rather a grainy image, but this is Riddlesworth Rectory, very nice Georgian architecture, which sits, and I'll position on a map in a minute. So once he'd done all of that, Bevan then transformed the landscape. And we have to keep bearing in mind, he was there for 25 years. And it doesn't seem to be that he did all this work with the intention of staying there. This was the second estate that he moved into, did up, and then sold on. And when he left Riddlesworth, he then did it again at another estate. So it's almost like his hobby in a way, although rather an expensive hobby. So he transformed the landscape. As you can see, we have £7,000 being spent on it. He experimented with agricultural practice, so floating water meadows, and he planted nearly 1 million trees around the estate, some of them really beautiful specimen trees, so fairly unique trees for the environment, including this one that we can see front and centre there, this rather lovely one here, which I think is a Lebanon cedar. There we are, you can see it slightly closer up. So some of these trees are now approaching the end of their useful life, and a couple have had their tops taken off and that sort of thing, but there are still some very good examples set within the landscape. He also planted various screens of trees so that he didn't have to look at the farms. So most of the farms were hidden by a screen of trees. And as I said, he experimented with agricultural practice. So it's fascinating to get an idea of the mindset of the man, that he seemed to be interested in everything and interested in making the land more productive as well. So we have various reports. This is from the Annals of Agriculture from 1793. So he had a bet with Coke of Holcombe about the produce of cows. Would longhorned Leicester cows produce more butter than polled Suffolk cows? And I'm pleased to say that Bevan won on that score. He produced more produce. And similarly, he experimented with these water meadows, as you can see, where he practiced flooding the land in order to improve the quality of the soil. So he dug a large number of irrigation ditches across the land within the Riddlesworth estate. So here's the tithe map of 1840, just to give you an idea of everything he was doing, and in particular of the gardens, because it wasn't just large landscaping. We can see a fine selection of kitchen gardens here as well. So let me put my pointer on. Here's the hall, just there with that yard next to it. Here is the rectory and the rectory stables next to it. That's the church just there. And then up here, still Riddlesworth land, we can see a number of enclosed gardens. This one was the formal kitchen garden just here, and later orchard was planted as well. So he was a huge improver, massive, and he changed the appearance of the estate significantly. I said that he built 2 lodge houses. Here you see them, East Lodge and West Lodge. So at the time, the principal road ran very close to the hall. So the lodges marked the boundary of the road. And he applied for a road order, and he had the road moved from here. He said it was for the greater convenience of travellers. I think it may actually have been to get people further away from the hall. So he established the road in the new position where it is now. So this is the 1066 for anybody who knows this particular area. So that's where the road was moved to. So having tidied everything up, Bevan at that point sells everything, and he sells it to the Thornhill family. So this is the third of the 4 families who take over the estate. And here we have a rather nice caricature of Thomas Thornhill III, published in 1893. Whoops. So just like the Drurys insisted on calling everybody by the same name, the Thornhills did it too. So we have 3 generations of Thornhill at Riddlesworth, and they're all called Thomas, as you can see. And they continued to develop the estate, but according to their own particular tastes. The Thornhills were particularly into horse breeding and horse racing. They have 2 Derby winners, and the first Thornhill married 3 times during his time at Riddlesworth. But interestingly, according to the documentation, never produced a son, which does rather beg the question of where Thomas Thornhill II came from. We haven't managed to figure that one out yet. He may have been adopted in, or he may have been an illegitimate son, or he may just have slipped through the documentary record. One of the things that the Thornhills did was to update the church. So this is an engraving by Robert Ladbroke, who engraved a lot of Norfolk churches in the late 18th century. And this is St. Peter's Riddlesworth. As you can see, we've now got that porch which has been added. and we have some of the thatch replaced by a tile roof there. And the Thornhills decided to bring it right up to date, and this is what they did to it. The thatch was replaced, as you can see, with tile throughout, and we have the addition of the chancel going on to the east end there. In no small part, this was done in order to create a family tomb beneath, so we have a crypt underneath that east end. And it also meant taking away a lot of the existing monuments within the church, not the Drury monument, thankfully, but some of the later Drury monuments were originally table tombs, and now they've been turned into sort of wall revetment instead. So it did have quite an impact. But this is really the church that we still have today now. And we know this is 1855 because it was recorded in the parish Bible, which is still in the church, that the Thornhill family undertook this for the good of the parish. They were clearly quite progressive because even before the Education Act required it, they were thinking about education for local children. So the East Lodge House that I showed you earlier, which was constructed by Bevan, was extended to create the schoolroom on the back that you see here. And this, for a long time, was the village school for Gasthorpe, Riddlesworth, Nettishall, the surrounding villages. And I did find this rather lovely photograph. This is 1928. We can see it was quite well attended as well, even though it was a single room school. It clearly had a large school population. And we talked to somebody who was there in the war, who remembers that when bombers were taking off from the local airfield, all the children in the school were put on the back of trucks and taken out of the danger zone in case a bomb went off by mistake. So the school had quite a long life, although it is no longer functioning. We also have these surrounding cottages being constructed. And again, it's about service for the hall. So Laundry Cottage, it's one of the further away buildings, and unsurprisingly, it was constructed to be the laundry for the hall. So within, it still retains some of the drying racks and so on. It was a very useful construction to have, and again, quite up to date, really. We also have the gamekeeper's cottage, and helpfully, they use the same architecture throughout. As you can see, we have this flint work with a very distinctive brickwork pattern around the windows, this machiculation pattern just there. And we find it on Gamekeeper's Cottage, which similarly, the name tells us the job. This was because the Thornhill family also enjoyed shooting, and so needed a gamekeeper. And we also have the stud being constructed at the same time, and using the same architecture, as you can see. So adding a lot at that point to the buildings on the estate and the functionality of the estate as well. And Thornhill II and Thornhill III weren't resident at Riddlesworth in the same way that Thornhill I was, and both of them gained income from renting out the Riddlesworth estate as a place where one could go and do shooting. So the various cottages were probably quite useful for that as well. So here we go to 1883, the OS map, which again gives us an idea of what the estate looked like, or at least the centre of the estate looked like at this time. It gives us a clearer view of the church land, the rectory here, rectory stables and church. And then here we have the hall with now a second courtyard just here. This is the coach house yard here. And this is always called the piggery here. I can't believe pigs were kept that close to the hall, but they are sort of lower level agricultural buildings, certainly. We still have some of the walled garden up here. And this is interesting. We have an ice house marked. I haven't been able to find any sign of that ice house now. It seems to have vanished completely. But at one point during the Thornhill era, a man's body was found in there, which was then eventually buried at the church, although there was a lot of uncertainty about whether he should be given a Christian burial or not. So here we are. We have the hall once again, and then we have the buildings being added in by the Thornhill family, just to show you where they are in relation to each other. So the estate's sort of spreading out architecturally at this point. Ultimately, the Thornhill family sell the hall on, and they sell it on to the final family. This is the Champion family, so the last of our four. So we have William Champion, who is very influential in the history of the hall. And then after William, the hall goes through the female line, which is why the names change, but these are all descendants of William Champion. The Champion family made their money from cloth production, and they seem to have been fairly wealthy, but also quite unlucky, because not long after buying the hall, they had a very devastating fire. As you can see, here we have a lovely photograph, 10th of February 1899, a huge fire engulfed Riddlesworth 2 and gutted it completely. It's a very instructive photograph, isn't it? Because we can see right through in the middle there. It shows us how completely the hall was damaged. Apparently, Mr. Champion was sitting down having his tea when the butler came in and told him that one of the chimneys was on fire. The fire brigade was sent for, but that meant sending someone on a horse to Thetford. And by the time they got back with the fire brigade, the hall had already really taken light. It burnt for the best part of 2 days, which is why we have this utter destruction at the end. But there was enough time to rescue most of the interior fittings, so possessions were got out. In particular, 5,000 cases of wine were retrieved from the cellar and stored in the church next door. So quite useful to have a church next door at that point. It's another useful image because it gives us a better idea of that rear facade than the previous image did. And I think we can see the brickwork pattern just a bit. Here we can see the marks of brickwork. So interesting to see that the core of the building is taken away, but the brickwork itself has stood up the ravages of fire pretty well. So one option open to Champion would be just to sort of do it up, renovate. But he doesn't do that. He takes the opportunity to knock this building down completely and to build Riddlesworth 3, which is the current hall on the site. So this is what he replaces it with. And this is where it's very interesting. 1901, designed from H.J. Green in Norwich. So he used a local architect. And we can see we've really gone up a level in terms of the visible wealth of the building. It's far more complex in terms of its architectural design. It uses a much richer architectural language. This is the north front, and then this is the south front. It was also extended, as you can see at the eastern end, with an additional block of building here. This was accommodation for events like shooting parties and so on, and was known as the Cricketers' Pavilion. Here we see the interiors a little bit through the cross sections by Green himself. But the fascination for me is to look at how the building transforms from the Bevan structure to the Champion structure, and what that tells us about the two men as well, because this is much more showy and we can compare it. There's Bevan's building. I think it highly likely that one thing Champion did use was the foundations. Foundations are so expensive that it's foolish to not use them if you've got them. So the footprint of the hall stays largely the same. What changes is the articulation. So you can see on the front here, we move to ionic columns supporting the balustraded section there. We have these pediments up at the top, which we didn't have in the earlier structure, each with carved decoration within. And there's much more substantial dental work. We've got decorative coins down the edges there. Still got the rusticated base. So you can sort of see how the Bevan design leads into this design. This design is just more elaborate. But I would also say for when it's being built, 1901, it's also a bit out of date because architecture has moved on at this point. So buildings being constructed have either embraced the Victorian Gothic style or they've even moved forward into things like arts and crafts. And this is, in a way, backward looking. And all we can say about that is perhaps it tells us about the tastes of Champion, that this is what he wanted. He bought an old manor house, so he wanted to live in an old manor house. So he constructs something which reflects that. If we go around to the rear, we can see, again, it's an aggrandization of the earlier building. So we still have that portico section, but here it's been turned into something far grander. We've got Corinthian here, Corinthian columns, a giant order raised on pedestals, all on the rusticated base, and also projected forward slightly as well with the pediment on top. So it just has a greater visual impact. So perhaps, whilst it must have been jolly annoying to have your house burned down, perhaps Champion seized the opportunity to create something which really exemplified his tastes at that time. All of that said, it's not that big when you go inside, which is quite surprising. Here we have a ground plan, and you can see it's not very many rooms. The rooms off to this, these are all these service rooms here. So there's the butler's pantry, and then the housekeeper's pantry, and then somebody else's pantry. Downstairs takes you to the kitchens, and then upstairs takes you to various bedrooms. But quite a small number of actual usable spaces, and a huge amount given over to that lovely hall. It makes for a magnificent entrance area, certainly. We also have the Riddlesworth Lake that you see here. This is something which we did see in the earlier OS maps that we looked at, but it's an ornamental lake, which means it really wasn't very deep at all. More a lake for punts than for any serious boating, but it added to that effect of landscape, and it existed until wartime when it was drained, and the local legend is it was drained because it would be too visible to bombers coming in, that it would give them something to pinpoint, which may be the case because we have to remember excuse me, that Riddlesworth was very close to Nettershall Airfield, which was a huge airfield in World War II. So that may have been a consideration. Here we see the lake in the OS map. So here's the hall up at the top there. There's the schoolhouse that we were looking at. And then down here, we have the artificial lake with a little boathouse at the front there. And the boathouse looked like that. It's a simple brick-built building, thatch with racks to hold canoes and so on. It's almost entirely gone now. You can still see the foundations. If you work your way through the undergrowth, there's still a bit of brickwork present, but with every passing year, it gets a bit less substantial. If we go into the Ladies Grove Wood, so let's just go back to that map. Here we see Ladies Grove. That's the woods to the west of the hall itself. And within them, we have this rather lovely feature of gravestones, but these are gravestones for champion pets. So we have the Black Spaniel Diogenes, and also Westwind, a roan mare who's buried here. So fascinating to consider the difficulties really of burying a horse apart from anything else. But yes, these continue to be there in the Ladies' Wood. In the last round of building by the Champion family, we have the butler's cottage. And this obviously was created for the butler of the hall. And it really is a mark of where things are going in terms of the estate, because getting and maintaining staff levels became increasingly difficult. And it's one of the things which led to the decline of the estate. So once upon a time, your butler would have been quite happy with the room he was given. By 1901, he gets his own house, and it's a very lovely house, as you can see, slightly down the road from the hall. We also have a further lodge house being built. So this lodge house is out on the main road on the 1066, which is the road that had been moved by Bevan. And so this is the last of the lodges to be constructed, and it sits opposite the grand approach to Riddlesworth Hall. So here we see the location of those buildings. Butler's Cottage, as you can see, very close to the hall, and then the North Lodge slightly further away there. So all of this, again, adding to the site. So really, at this point, we're into the modern era, and we can see that the estate, although it's changed, it's stayed whole. It stayed as a single entity up until this point, with different pieces being added in according to the whims of the owner. So the decline, when it comes, is actually pretty quick, because we find that the estate is sold off piecemeal very quickly, and it's sold off after the death of Thornhill. Once the estate is passed down that female line, none of those women are resident. They have their own homes elsewhere. And so bit by bit, the cottages, the farms, and so on are sold off, but not the hall for a long time. That stayed in family ownership. And we find Felixstowe Ladies' College being evacuated to Riddlesworth in the war. So this is the beginning of the school and the school's presence at Riddlesworth. And it continued to be used as a school after World War II, because after World War II, these grand country houses were no longer really suitable for the kind of lives that people were living. Taxes had gone up, nobody had quite so much money. It was much harder to get staff because people had more opportunities than they had previously had. And a life in service didn't have the allure that once it might have had. So moving with the times, we see the end of the estate and it being split up. And the last piece to go is the hall itself, which was finally sold off in 1984 and is currently, as you can see, I filched this off the internet, it's currently used as Riddlesworth Hall School. So there we are. Riddlesworth, the estate, is now a collection of separate buildings, but a lot of them are still there and they're all jolly interesting. And it also tells us a little bit about those various families as well. So there we go. That is Riddlesworth, the rise and the decline of the estate. There.
Wow. Thank you very much indeed. No, something's come up and covered my screen.
Oh dear. I can still see you, yes.
Okay.